I'm privileged to be able to speak to the Society this evening on a contemporary archaeology project. Alex Hale and I were having a quick chat beforehand and wondering whether this is the first contemporary archaeology lecture that's been given to the Society over the years. There may well have been others, but certainly 1988 is fairly recent. And before I go on to justify why this is an archaeological project, I want to quickly name check and thank the two other men on the screen in this photograph here, Lex Lamb and Gordon Barr, who are the two other parts of the After the Garden Festival project. And Lex is in the audience this evening, and if you have any questions that are more specifically Glasgow Garden Festival, I was trying to find you there, more Glasgow Garden Festival focused, then Lex will be able to answer, and I may well have to ask you a few things during the course of the lecture. So this is very much a collaboration, and what I'm reporting on this evening is largely the archaeological side of the project, which is what I'm responsible for. One of the questions that I've been asked constantly when speaking to journalists about the archaeology of an event that happened in 1988 is, why is this archaeology? Why are archaeologists interested in something that happened in my lifetime? You're making me feel old. Those sort of comments that came from journalists and various people that visited the excavations. And contemporary archaeology is something which has been around for quite a few decades, but still hasn't really, I think, reached the public consciousness about it being part of what archaeologists do. There's been quite a few notable projects that are well known within archaeology that's kick-started the notion of an archaeology of us, using archaeological methods and techniques and ways of thinking about how we interact with material culture and the world around us by focusing on more recent examples. So there are classic examples from the early 2000s and late 1990s, the excavation of an abandoned council house flat, or the very detailed excavation analysis of a knackered transit van that had been used by an excavation unit, I think it was Cambridge. Both projects which really tested some of the assumptions we have about archaeological methods. Because if we can use archaeological methods to shed light on things that we actually know something about, then it can be used as a way to, as a proof of concept for what we do as archaeologists. But I think more importantly, it's became very obvious with these kinds of projects, and contemporary archaeology projects have become increasingly focused on actually very useful social benefit projects, for instance, working with homeless communities and things like that. Contemporary archaeology has been shown to actually shed surprising light on even recent events. Things that we imagine we must know and remember, or that have been documented in great detail, actually that assumption starts to crumble when we analyse things archaeologically. And I think that by using archaeology as a method in a project that's examining something that happened 30 odd years ago, it's actually highlighted once again that memories are surprisingly short and that not everything is documented that humans do. We think we live in a digital age now where everything has been recorded, but 1988 was an analog photography age, so there are actually surprisingly few photographs available online until our project started to collect them. There's not very much video footage, and there's a surprising lack of archive material that actually explains everything that happened during the festival. And indeed, a proper history of the Glasgow Garden Festival has never been written. And that's something that the project has been helping to make happen. So archaeology exists in a very interesting space between memories and photographs and documents and archives, finding things that are the remnants of often quite transitory human activities, throwing things away, throwing rubbish in a bin, dropping something, some kind of act that happens that is not something that's recorded or documented. Archaeology fills in those kinds of spaces. Because for me, archaeology is not so much about things that happened at any particular time in the past. Archaeology is a set of techniques and methods and ways of engaging with the world which are distinctive and unique to our discipline and which can add something to our understanding of even more recent events. And I hope in this lecture this evening, I'll persuade you that by doing archaeology of something that happened in 1988 and what's happened since, we've been able to shed light on some aspects of this event that weren't previously understood or known about. And we've also been able to raise a lot of awareness about the project and to engage lots of people in the nostalgia and memory associated with this seminal event in Glasgow's modern history. And I would encourage you not to blow my own trumpet, but if you want to read more about contemporary archaeology, I recently wrote a blog post for Dig It, which the link's is online there, but I'm sure you can find it easy enough if you want to, which has a much more detailed explanation of why contemporary archaeology matters. Now, the approach that I've taken for this has very much been inspired by this fantastic book written by Johnny Gardner, which is called A Contemporary Archaeology of London's Mega Events, and you can download this book freely online as a PDF. And essentially in this book, Johnny looked at a series of major cultural events in London, including things like the big exhibitions and the Olympic Games and other mega events, to try and understand the events from an archaeological perspective. And that included doing quite traditional archaeological fieldwork, crawling over the sites and looking to see what remains, often quite mundane things that still are on the ground that represent surviving traces of past events, whether recent or in the last century. But also what's important and what Johnny's done, which is something that's really powerful about contemporary archaeology, is that he has also carried out interviews, so he spoke to people. So oral histories are a very important part of contemporary archaeology. He's consulted archives, looked at old photographs, looked at documentation. You can, of course, there's lots of video footage of the Olympics and so on. And so it's a very powerful combination here of techniques which actually encapsulate everything that pulls together that might help us understand events that are maybe not as documented as well as we think. Because I can absolutely guarantee that in 100 years' time, things that we think are recent or happening now will be not within anyone's living memory, and there'll be surprisingly poor records of what's happened and what people have been doing. So this is something that's been quite inspiring. But for me also, this project started really with a rather unusual discovery. Now, in another guise, I write a blog called The Urban Prehistorian, where I look at prehistoric sites and things in urban places. And I saw a photograph online of a massive head propped up on the side of the River Clyde. And I made some inquiries with some people that I knew who were on this Clyde Bank History website. And someone said, oh, that's from the Glasgow Garden Festival. And it struck me as being sort of monstrous and prehistoric in its scale. So one day I went over to a scrapyard in Erskine with a colleague and tried to find the big head. We asked around in the scrapyard, and no one knew anything about a big head, but we caught sight of it just behind that this caravan and bus arrangement on one part of the scrapyard. And then the guys at the scrapyard were completely astounded, and they said, "Oh, Jimmy, there's a big head over there. Did you not see that?" So there were a lot of them were over to see this giant head propped up on the bank of the Clyde, like a moa from Rapa Nui. And it turns out that this is an artwork that was created for the Glasgow Garden Festival by the artist Richard Groom, called Floating Head. And this was indicative, perhaps, of the kind of the quite complicated stories of the things that were created for the Garden Festival and what happened to them after the festival was dismantled. And I'll come back to that broader issue in a few minutes. Between one thing and another, Richard Groom, I think, died, and his family wanted the artwork to be revived. And then the sculpture placement group raised some money, and in 2021, I think, it was refloated on the Clyde again, not looking quite as smart as it had been during the festival. Essentially, it's a boat with a giant head on the top of it, on one face on one side of it. But since then, it's now in another dock somewhere further down the Clyde, and it's not really very publicly accessible. So this is an artwork that really doesn't have a home, but has got this complicated biography. And so I wrote a blog post about this, and it got some media coverage, but that also started me communicating on Twitter with Lex, and so that was really the catalyst for me finding out that he had this bizarre obsession with what had happened to all of the things that were at the Glasgow Garden Festival, and we decided, along with Gordon, to start to think more formally about that as part of a project and to try and tell more of these stories. But then that became something much more than we ever imagined when we started off a few years ago, or a couple of years ago. So the event we're talking about is the Glasgow Garden Festival. Who in the audience here was at the Garden Festival? Yeah, see, once you go over to Edinburgh, the numbers are slightly lower than over in Glasgow, where everyone was there, more or less. So even here, lots of people were at this event in 1988. It was a hugely popular event that ran for 5 months from April to September 1988. And it was one of a series of biannual garden festival events that were organised by the Conservative government at the time, working with local government and public and private finance to deliver these events, these garden festivals that were essentially trying to catalyse the redevelopment of post-industrial landscapes. And so, as we'll see, here we have a classic example of that on the south side of the Clyde, where we had an area that used to be graving docks and a shipyard, the remnants of Glasgow and the Clyde being a centre of trade with the rest of the world. And this area had gradually been abandoned and the docks filled in, and we had this sort of industrial wasteland that was lying that needed to be redeveloped. And the plan was that this festival would happen. It was only ever meant to be a temporary festival, and once it was finished, the site would gradually be cleared, and then the area would then be used for housing, and other facilities to try and kind of regenerate the area, which worked to an extent, but took something like 30 years for most of the land to actually be rebuilt. It was the most popular and the most successful of all of the garden festivals. The others were in places like Stoke and Liverpool and Gateshead, and one in Wales. I can't remember the name of the Welsh one. And there was over 4 million visitors that came along to the festival. And we know also from interviews that Lex has been doing with some of the main players that there was huge numbers of local people with season tickets, and it was a hugely popular and fondly remembered event, even though it only actually lasted for a few months. And it also very strong branding as well, which you can see from the T-shirt there, and also from this wonderful Glasgow Garden Festival jumper, which my wife knitted recently using a pattern that was for sale at the Garden Festival that we found in the Mitchell Library archives. So Jan knitted this fantastic original 1980s jumper with big puffy sleeves. And I'm not going to go any more into this anymore, other than to say that it was a seminal point in Glasgow's modern history, along with other things like Glasgow being European City of Culture, the Glasgow's Miles Better campaign at the time, and it was part of the modern rebranding and rebirth of Glasgow, and it holds a very fond place in the heart of many people in the city. The footprint of the site itself is now almost entirely developed, but it was on the south side of the Clyde. Those of you who know Glasgow, it's essentially across from the SECC and the Hydro, occupying a kind of a funny pan-shaped body of land, 120 acres in size, stretching from the Govan graving docks, which remain undeveloped, in Pacific Quay in the west, right to Springfield Quay, which is near Kingston Bridge in the east, and then down to Govan Road and what's now Festival Park, which is the only green space that's really been retained from the festival site. So it's fairly near the city centre, and part of that was facilitated by the creation of 2 bridges as well, footbridges across to the other side of the Clyde, which are still there. And this area has been massively redeveloped since then, with new roads that have been added. The BBC Scotland headquarters are there, STV, the Science Centre, and all sorts of other hotels and gyms and things like that, and some housing too, which was created partly for the festival. So there's actually, it's actually a radically changed site. During the course of the festival, though, it was a place where it was a place of wonder and magic, really. I mean, I was there. My parents had a season ticket. I was there many times. I don't really have hugely detailed memories other than the fact that it was incredibly exciting. There were fairground rides. There was all sorts of different thematic gardens and places to visit and buildings. There was lots of transport, trams, trains. There was things on the river. There was lots of cafes and restaurants. And all of this was organised thematically into these very general themes and zones, science and technology or health and well-being. And these were all populated by different attractions that were created for or by, for instance, new towns, or by local authorities, or by government agencies, and sometimes by businesses or lobbying groups as well, universities and so on. So there was all sorts of different things going on, and it was incredibly vibrant. So it wasn't just things like one of the most famous aspects was the Coca-Cola roller coaster, which I think was one of the first, maybe the first upside-down roller coaster in Scotland, but also memorable because of the commercial branding, which was still quite unusual at that time. But also there were shops and gift shops, there was trams, there was an incredible variety of artworks and sculptures, and there was lots and lots of things going on. And it was, but there was also a daily programme of events as well, as I'll come back to. So this was a very a big site that was just full of lots of things to do, and people were visiting again and again, as I said. And it was a series of distinctive and very unusual structures that were either built specifically for the festival or were moved on after it, or were already there in the landscape. Now, the After the Garden Festival project initially started off with the aspiration of tracking down everything that was part of the Glasgow Garden Festival. So I can't remember the exact number. There's about over 250 things on your spreadsheet and the website. So our website, which I'll show in a moment, has got every building, structure, vehicle, all the different aspects of the festival site that were then, after September 1988, were gradually taken off the site. Some of the things were sold off in auctions, some things were taken and used elsewhere, some things were probably destroyed, and there was an element of landscaping which survived and survives in the landscape today as well. So one of the things that we've created is a website where people can upload photographs, and they can also help track down where things are now. And I'm not quite sure how many, but there's 70 or 80 success stories or things that we know where they are now. So then this gradually morphed into something more. We wanted to think about, well, if we know where things have gone to after the festival, what remains on the site itself, and that's where the archaeology comes in. But we also wanted to more broadly understand the process of the festival's creation, its management, and its dismantlement at the end of the process, and its legacy. And so to that end, Lex has carried out a series of interviews with lots of people who worked at the festival, who were involved in running different aspects of it, and that's been really valuable in helping us understand the physical landscape of the site as well. And so this has been a process of just trying to find out where things have gone, and in some cases that's relatively straightforward. For instance, this church garden and pavilion, this glass structure, a big fancy greenhouse essentially, which served as a kind of a multi-denominational church space at the festival site, is now in Carfin Grotto in North Lanarkshire. So it's still being used for having a religious purpose. And all of this is documented on our website, which you're welcome to visit and explore. And that's got thousands of photographs that have been crowdsourced from the public, which show objects during the festival and also sometimes after the festival as well. And the stories are told where we have the evidence for that. And that's been supported by an army of the public who have been submitting images to the website, but also some amateur detectives who have tracked down some really obscure survivals of things around, not just in Scotland, but beyond elsewhere in the world as well. So I encourage you to have a look at that if you're interested. So the project has carried out a variety of different activities. We've done a series of walks around the Garden Festival site, for Doors Open Day, for instance, where we actually walk around and look at the physical surviving traces on the ground. We've done lots of talks as well to heritage groups and to other Glasgow groups and organisations in particular. In 2023, we helped co-design an exhibition, How Did the Garden Grow, with the New Glasgow Society, which is initially was in their premises in the West End of Glasgow, but has moved to one or two local libraries around the city as well. And again, part of that has been about looking at the archaeological aspect of what we've been doing. So this is really very much a story of trying to make sense of what survives of all of these amazing things that were pulled together for the festival. And this is just a couple of examples, because it's not really the main focus of what we want to talk about this evening. Are the often surprising and sometimes sad stories that we have related to some of these objects. So on the left here, sorry, the photograph's a bit small. We have a font, a circular font. It's like a millstone that was used within the church greenhouse building that I showed a few minutes ago, and it's now located beside the Renfield Centre in Bath Street in Glasgow city centre, next to a church, in a slightly sad arrangement of dead flowers. No longer functional, but it does have a little plaque beside it, which has got the Garden Festival logo and says that this is what this object is. So things were moved around and ended up in strange places. Perhaps sadder is the fate of the Royal Bank of Scotland Children of Glasgow fountain, which is a really spectacular fountain, which was situated in the festival, and then at some point was moved to the back end of the Kelvingrove Museum, where it stood in a nice little kind of green plinth. And then at some point after that, and only because of a tip-off I got from someone I know from Western Bartonshire Council, who said had heard about some garden festival stuff in a Glasgow Park store. I won't say which park this can be found in, but this statue is now lying in a sorry state in amongst a vegetation in a Glasgow City or Glasgow Council depot in one of the parks, and you can actually see on these pictures the grassing over logo of the Royal Bank of Scotland. So some of these have got stories that are not got happy endings. Others are objects that still are surviving, and that we've been able to document this through the work that's been done by Lex and gathering things together on the website. So the Coca-Cola roller coaster, we've now got photographs of it being constructed, of it being used, lots of photographs of it being used, and also it being dismantled at the end of the process. And we know also since the Garden Festival, it's appeared in 2 different other theme parks with different names. So it was in a theme park in Derbyshire called Missile. It was called Missile, and it's now called Wipeout, and is in a theme park in Lowestoft, although we have yet to go and ride that to get the full experience. And none of us actually went on it during the festival because either we were too small or too scared to go on an upside-down roller coaster. And more recently, we came across an amazing archive by Ruth Duncan, who worked at the festival site, and she had things like these amazing signs that were from the festival site, including the thrill ride, which I think is what the roller coaster was known most commonly as in the park. We also know that there was a huge amount of merchandise, and lots of people have got tea towels and bottles of branded whiskey and glasses and fridge magnets and all sorts of stuff lying around in drawers and in cupboards at home. People have tried to donate to us uniforms. We've met people wearing Garden Festival branded clothes. So I gave a lecture in Milgaya 18 months ago, and this chap turned up with a red Garden Festival jumper and with an umbrella, a golf umbrella. There's a souvenir brochure which is widely available on eBay for about £8 to £10, which has got a picture of Charles and Diana on the front, who were there for the official launch of the site. And then there's all sorts of other badges and pins and things that people have either given to us, which we weren't really ever intending to have a physical archive, but that seems to have gradually happened, or we know about from online. We've also undertaken a huge amount of archival research. There's incredible archives of newspaper clippings and leaflets and other sorts of ephemera held, for instance, in the Mitchell Library in Glasgow, the University of Glasgow's archives as well. And so these kind of formal archives have been really useful in helping us to fill in some gaps in our knowledge. There are also some businesses which have got their own personal archives related to, for instance, landscaping work or things that they did during the festival, although those are very incomplete, so we don't have... so a lot of businesses we've contacted don't really have any records of what they actually did at the festival. We know they had a presence, like I think the Bowmore Distillery is an example of that, where they didn't really have much that they could tell us about what they did during the festival. But even more rich information's come from a series of donations and personal archives that we've had access to, just that have come our way for a variety of different reasons, through contacts and through people just getting in touch with us. This wonderful collection of material from Sheila Stewart, which directly related to the the Cumbernauld Newtown tram stop, which included the famous floating tap artwork and various other features. And we know now from this archive that they actually created a scale model of this part of the garden, this incredible photograph in the bottom right of a scale model. This was drawn out, planned out. We've got all of the contract information about how much the tenders cost to make the big tap, what it cost to repair it when it broke down. An incredible level of detail, and showing the huge amount of effort and creativity that went into just creating one tiny corner of the festival site. And this material has all now been donated to North Lanarkshire Council's Heritage Service and for their archives. Also recently, one of our students managed to facilitate from a friend of hers a whole carrier bag full of stuff, including sheets of stickers, programs for daily events, newspaper archives, all sorts of stuff. It's just really incredibly rich information, and it shows that how much stuff is out there that people have kept. And this has allowed us, and Lex has been able to start to pull together an incredible programme. Every day there was a programme of events with performers and with street theatre, with magicians, with music, with all sorts of stuff happening all over the site in different performance spaces or just randomly about the site. And so I think we've got an idea of every day what was happening during the festival. Lex even knows what the weather was like every day as well. And we've also got other things. Here's from Ruth Duncan's archive, is a menu from the Lock-in restaurant, which is from near where we've been doing field work. And also I've got this incredible resource of these images being supplied by members of the public. These are some slides that were scanned by my father-in-law, Michael Gannon, from his slide collection, which have been really helpful, in particular in terms of the Roman archaeology and also the Celtic shop, which he photographed in multiple times. So we've got this incredible record of archive material that we've been pulling together as part of the project, and it will help us to understand an event that is in living memory, but also is one that that level of detail is not really, most people aren't really aware of the huge amount of detail and creativity that went into making this event happen. So the archaeology is very much an important part of us trying to understand the story of this site. And of course, the first thing we started to think about was the development of this particular location. And so we've done some desk-based assessment work and also tried to think about the development of the site itself, because there's actually a rich industrial heritage in the Glasgow Garden Festival site as well, but that tends to be a bit overshadowed by the events of 1988. And so we can go back and look at the earlier OS edition maps from the late 19th century, where this was essentially, on the south side of Clyde, there was just some farm buildings and a road and some nursery plots. But then that was radically transformed in the early 20th century into a series of graving docks, and the Clyde was expanded and manipulated to enable that to happen and to get big ships to land in this area. So what here on the south of the Clyde is actually is just farmland and some houses gradually became completely transformed, as we'll see. By chance, as it happens, when they were creating one of the graving docks, Princess Dock, someone found a Bronze Age battle axe, which is held in the collections of Glasgow museums, but which, as far as I can tell, no work or analysis has ever been done with this particular object. I've had a look at it, but that's as far as it goes. And we don't have any specific context for its discovery. But it does start to hint at the fact that there's stuff in the Clyde, and that's something that was very much part of the story of the Garden Festival, as we'll see. So when we think about the industrial heritage of this landscape, we've got this radically transformed landscape now, going on 50 years from the first mapping of this location on the south of Clyde. We've now got these huge finger-like wharfs or docks with big warehouses running down in between them on both sides of the river. So the area that's now the SECC was all docks as well, and all of it was essentially opened up to water. And again, this gives you a real sense of what this place looked like. This is an aerial photograph, I think, from the 1930s. And to give you a sense of where we are now, north roughly to the top right-hand corner of that aerial photograph, and this is Festival Park, where we carried out our excavation work, and where and was one corner of the Glasgow Garden Festival site. So this, where we are now working archaeologically, was 70, 80 years ago water for the most part in docks. So this is a landscape that's been radically transformed, and this has impacted on the archaeology we can do here, because the backfilling of these docks has created a signature that means we can't use magnetometry for geophysics because it confuses the reading too much. Now, these docks gradually went out of use as the Clyde became less of a focus for heavy industry, and obviously a whole series of things changed and transformed as Glasgow went into industrial decline. And by the time we come to 1985, this area was largely a wasteland, documented in a film that's held in the National Film Library collections from 1985, which shows these kind of abandoned, dilapidated warehouses, some of the graving docks still in place, and lots of kind of fallen down structures. There were still some buildings here that were dating back to the late 19th, early 20th centuries. We'll see, like the Southern Rotunda. But for the most part, this was a wasteland, exactly the kind of landscape that was earmarked for a garden festival. And so the radical transformation of this place was actually very quick. From 1985, when this was essentially a kind of watery warehouse wasteland, it was transformed into this incredible, dense site full of all sorts of wonders and attractions and rich gardens. And this included, and this photograph on the left here is from Canmore, which has got the festival partly being dismantled. I think this might be from early 1989. And there's some amazing national vertical aerial photography showing the festival itself. And again, you can see this real complexity. And once you start to compare the aerial photography of the festival with the mapping that was produced as part of the brochures and the leaflets for the festival, it quickly becomes clear that the mapping was out of date by the time the festival actually happened, because they were improvising, they were changing as they were doing things. Things were being installed, gaps were being filled that were maybe unexpected. And so these vertical aerial photographs actually offer probably the best study of what was happening on the ground, as opposed to any of the documentation that was produced at the time for the Garden Festival. And I think these aerial photographs are what Lex has been using to try and pin down where everything was, and have an understanding of the footprint of the site itself. So, as part of this broader process, we decided we wanted to establish, is there anything that's still left on the site that actually relates to the festival, other than some of the more obvious landscaping that was there in Festival Park. And Festival Park is where we decided to focus. This is this small strip of land that was in the bottom south-east corner of the site, bounded by Govan Road. And it's the only place that has retained any real footprint of the festival on the ground, other than a part of the Antiquaries, which I'll mention again briefly later on. Now, this is quite frustrating, because there was a bigger area of housing that was constructed about 5 years ago, which was in a place where there would have been festival elements on the ground as well, but those were swept away by this development. Essentially there was no need, as far as the council and WOSAS were concerned, for any archaeological evaluation to happen on this site, because as far as they were concerned, they knew that this was a post-industrial site that had been the Glasgow Garden Festival. Therefore, you didn't have to have a watching brief or an evaluation. So all of the development that's happened at on the Garden Festival site, none of it has had any archaeological evaluation undertaken in advance. And so many traces will have been lost because of that. And this is kind of indicative. Even last year, the council destroyed surviving features of the festival to do some landscaping within Festival Park, simply because it wasn't regarded as heritage or as something that had any significance beyond just a more modern bit of landscaping. So there's an issue here with the status of these kinds of heritage sites, which are actually very important parts of our recent history, and yet can be swept away by a bulldozer or by a guy with a shovel, just because no one really thinks it's that important. And one of the things in this project we want to do is to raise the importance of this as a significant heritage site for Glasgow. So, for instance, there's a large waterfall feature, which I'll come back to in a few minutes, which I think that we should look to do as part of the Adopt a Monument scheme, because it is one of Glasgow's great monuments. But at any time, someone from the council could go and decide that they want to plant a new flower bed there, and things will be removed from it. So it's quite a fragile resource, despite the fact it's very recent. Anyway, this park was part of the festival where there was various different features going on. We had the Bowmore Distillery, which had included a nice pot still. There was a restaurant next to it, a fancy restaurant in that white building in the middle, the Highland Restaurant, I think it was called, something like that. There was a display on the Scottish peat industry with lots of dummies and peat digging machines. There was a Go Ape type rope play zone. There was a miniature train line running through here, and that we'll come back to that later on for the 2024 fieldwork. But you can see top left a miniature train. That train is now in a theme park in Japan, incidentally. And the other thing that was here that was interesting, of course, to us is the Antonine Gardens, a reconstruction or replica of the Bear's Den Roman bathhouse, which has got in itself has got quite a colourful history since 1988. And I'll come back again to that soon. In this area, we also had some substantial landscaping features which are still evident on the ground. So this is the initial architect's drawings by Ian White Associates. Again, this changed in the actual delivery of the project, but it shows an interconnected series of water features, including the Lochen, which is a kind of loch type area with a stream. And at the far right-hand end, the east end, there was a big waterfall, and this whole thing was connected together with a sort of self-regulating water system that could be turned on and off, essentially. And the water would run down the waterfall, run through a stream, under the ground, out into the loch-in, and then it would disappear eventually and go back underground and be recycled in the waterfall again. And we have photographs of the waterfall being constructed in various different phases, and also Lex has interviewed Ian White as well about this, this really remarkable feat of engineering. This whole area was also landscaped with a lot of topography. Because this had been a flat area, once all the docks were filled in, then they started to create slopes and hills and topography for this part of the festival site, as well as planting lots of exotic plants and trees. And we found out during the project that most of this material was dredged up from the Clyde and was then piled up. And whoever, the guy that came up with the idea, won an environmental award for this notion of recycling this material from the bottom of the Clyde, which had the unintended consequence, of course, of all of the stuff from the bottom of the Clyde ending up dumped on the site, which I think one of these days we'll probably find some flints or some lithics in amongst this site that's just ended up in this location. So the waterfall, we did a bit of recording of the waterfall structure. The students did a plane table survey just to get a sense of the topography of this very extravagant structure, which is now kind of covered with trees and with lots of bamboo and things like that, whereas initially when it was constructed it was much more open. We couldn't do any excavation work there because there's a colony of newts that live in the pond at the bottom of the waterfall, but we were able to do a bit of cleaning up and exploration of a bizarre subterranean chimney, which seems to be was the way into the part of the pumping mechanism for the waterfall, which has since been filled in for safety reasons, but we did a bit of cleaning up and drawing. A lot of this was essentially training exercises for our students. We also carried out a series of excavations in the loch-in area of Festival Park, based on the premise that I thought, well, if we're going to find any material culture associated with the festival site, it's going to be in former watery places rather than, on grass and tarmac and so on, which there's no chance. And so we excavated a few areas within the loch-in and the edge of the loch-in, and we identified that much of the decorative stonework for the festival site is still in situ. We also came down at the bottom of the trench onto an incredibly thick geotextile fabric layer that essentially was the material that held the water into the system. So we could tell when we reached that area that we were in 1987, exactly, no plus or minus about it, and that was the bottom of our trenches. But also during this process as well, we found lots of bits and pieces, including a wonderful assemblage of rusty coins. When I gave these to Will Murray for conservation work, he was utterly bamboozled that he was being asked to conserve 1 and 2 pence coins, but we just couldn't tell from how corroded they were, how old they were. But of the 6 coins that we found in the trenches in the loch-in, 3 of them, believe it or not, dated from the 1970s, 1 and 2 pence coins. So although we can't be absolutely sure that these coins were thrown in to the water during the Garden Festival, we also can speculate, think perhaps these are the material remains of wishes that were cast by children in 1988. And interestingly, all of the coins were found at just about the right distance from the edge of the loch-in that a child could throw a coin. So that's something that we think could be related to the festival. Obviously, we can't prove that. But it's interesting we found these 70s coins, which is very peculiar. We found lots of other bits and pieces as well, lots of kind of rusty nails and screws that presumably were related to the dismantlement of bits of the festival around here. Lots of decorative pebbles and stonework and a golf ball as well for scale. And we also found some nice bits of this very good quality blue ceramic. And last year we actually found loads more of this stuff as well, which may relate to some garden festival feature, or it could also be tiling from an earlier industrial use of this landscape. But I suspect there's maybe a garden festival history to this ceramic, but we haven't pinned down exactly what that might be from. We also carried out some geophysical survey, essentially to try and look at some of the open green spaces to see if we could find anything that was surviving. And this was useful in terms of shedding light on the potential survival or otherwise of some of and also the permanence of some of the features. The square bit that's in the middle there, so this is only resistivity, we couldn't get mag to work. The square bit in the middle there was where the Bowmore Distillery was and the Highland Restaurant, and we found nothing at all. There's no sense there that there was even any drains dug or any piping under the ground, which suggests that perhaps all of the facilities and all of the kind of the drainage that was required for toilets and for kitchens and so on was all above ground, and this was just put there for the festival, and then it was taken away again at the end, and it left no physical imprint in the ground. However, in other areas we found more promising traces. We found what we thought was probably the route of the miniature railway line, and also a large area of disturbance that was beside or under where the Bearsden Roman bathhouse reconstruction had been. And so we decided 2 years later, in 2024, to go back and do a bit more investigation of these possible surviving subsurface traces of the festival, rather than the more speculative work we'd done in the water features. And so in June last year, we carried out an excavation of the mini railway line, and also we put a trench in next to where the Antonine Gardens had been as well. And then we started to find some quite complicated archaeology, but nonetheless, things which started to shed light on various different aspects of the festival site. And again, things that we don't have any record of actually happening. So this trench here ran through the route of the miniature railway line. And what we quickly found was that there was loads and loads of rubble in this trench, which was very likely related to material that was being used to level off the landscape before they started to transform it into a garden, or the garden festival, because this was all about creating an environment where plants could grow. So eventually we managed to, I think I managed to understand this now, this bit of the trench. We managed to basically understand that what seems to be happening in here is that we have this kind of basal rubble layer that's been built up of unknown depth. I don't know how far down this goes, because we gave up trying to get through it all. It was so dense and it was so deep. But this is on top of maybe even top of the graving docks. And then at some point, some very good quality garden soil was brought into the site, the kind of stuff that you would expect to find in a nice fancy garden. And so we've got a lot of very nice garden soil. And this was probably put here in 1986, 1987, when the festival site was being created and ready for planting. And then at some point after that, they then cut the railway line ditch through this nice garden soil. And we found this incredibly tough, thick concrete-like deposit at the bottom of a ditch that we half excavated, with a very, very straight edge to it, which runs parallel to where the railway line would have ran. And so here we have the archaeological version of what we see in this photograph on the top right of this slide, which is from Glasgow Council Archives, where we have the creation of the railway line, where we have very good quality garden soil, and then a hollow in the middle that's been dug through with material that was a hard core for the railway line. Most of that stuff was taken away. The tracks were taken away after the festival went out of was finished, and then they filled in with whatever was lying to hand, a kind of less good quality soil. And this all showed up in a very complicated but very satisfying section they were able to get into in this trench. And that photographic version of it is really quite exciting to find that evidence. We've made some really fantastic small finds in amongst this material as well. We found, for instance, this fragment of a green bit of oak wood post, with an interesting hexagonal form to it. And then we went back and looked at the photographs we have from the Garden Festival and found that the fence that defined the edge of the railway area was indeed a green painted wooden hexagonal style posts. So it's very exciting to find that these remains are still surviving on the ground. But the other thing that we found that was interesting was that the garden soil here was really full of ceramic and glass and bits of clay pipe, all sorts of stuff, because this material is being dredged from the Clyde or being brought from elsewhere to create this farming, this landscape for planting things on. And so we found all sorts of stuff that came from fields and from the surrounding landscape that was secondarily transferred to the Garden Festival site, including this wonderful fragment of this 1920s wine jug that was made for a series of hotels and other restaurants in Glasgow and Belfast. So the writing that we found in our shared says Grand Central Belfast Hotel. But one other side of this jug would have said the Regano, which is a famous restaurant in Glasgow, currently unfortunately closed. So that was a nice part of the story as well. So we've got this other complicating factor where all this stuff is coming in from elsewhere. And then we also found these plant tag traces, which were one of the top 5 archaeological discoveries in Scotland in 2024, according to Dig It, which is a fantastic honour for us to have. And these, two of them say red campion, one says it in English and one says it in Latin. And then they also have one that said time. And in our archives, one of our team members noticed a photograph which is very difficult to see even when you look at the photograph up close, where we've got the exact same place we were digging at the festival site with the green fence, and then there's someone over there with red gloves on putting plant tags into the soil. So I'm very confident these are plant tags from the Glasgow Garden Festival. So this is much more kind of tangible evidence that we're having from the coins we found in the Lochan. The other trench we looked at was located at the back end of the Antonine Gardens, and I'll come back to that feature in a bit more detail before we finish. And this seems to be an area that was used as something of a dumping ground after the festival site was being dismantled. So it's roughly in an area that would have been a very fancy bit of pathway running down to an artificial stream, and it's an incredibly waterlogged area that the council have problems with this part of the park. And inside that trench, we found whole fragments of brick walls that had just been thrown or dumped into this area, a real jumble of stuff. And some of this stonework had been painted with yellow and white symbols. We're not quite sure exactly where this came from. Very likely these are Garden Festival aspects of architecture that have ended up being thrown into this boggy, waterlogged area when the festival site was being dismantled. So we have here a sort of an insight into a completely undocumented process of things being brought here, thrown into this boggy area, and the site being dismantled, perhaps in some haste after the festival ended. And we found all sorts of other stuff here, including a ginger nuts packet, which sadly the best before date was missing the year. It was November, but we didn't know the year. And we think that was probably maybe the earliest date we could have for that is 1990, because the McVitie's logo that's on that was introduced in 1990. But we haven't been able to pin that down. But it was under some bricks, so it's a secure context, I would say. So that may be a snack from people who are dismantling the site. And the dismantlement of the festival site probably happened over a number of years in various different places. And this is just a drone image of this. The bottom spit that we got to in this trench, which shows again a jumble of bricks and material, but also this yellow, sort of very kind of friable deposit that came through in this trench that looks a bit like paving or some kind of path surface. It was about 5 centimetres thick. But again, we're not sure if it's just something that's been dumped there or whether this is an in situ path. But there's certainly all sorts of stuff happening in this trench. Now, the other thing that we want to do, and we haven't completed doing yet, is to do a proper measured survey of the whole of the Garden Festival site. As I said already, there's 120 acres, and it's not all just Festival Park. There's much more to it than that. And in amongst of the urban development of this area, we still find Garden Festival features surviving. Notably, these black and white painted ship bollard things painted by the artist Daniel Buren as part of a broader artwork where there was lots of these across the site, not just the original shipyard ones that were painted black and white. There are features like the steps, which were next to the Lochan, which the council have completely changed in the last year, unfortunately. They were a great survivor of the festival site. And one or two bits of signage as well. So there's a sign on the top right that says Red Spider, which is a sign for a red spider fuchsia flower. And then we've also got a plaque next to the black and white bollard that's for an artwork that was situated at that part of the pier as well. And then as we crawl around the site a bit more, we find various things. We find industrial heritage. So these are ceramic bricks that are probably from a toilet block from a 19th century shipyard that was located here, or a factory. But also on this wall here, I spent a lot of time looking at this wall. And this wall I've highlighted on the left the red fuchsia spider sign. But we've also got a pattern of hanging basket screws that are in the wall. And these, basically, there's a pair of screws, and then there's one further down and back up, and these are all the same distance apart. There's also other screws under the signs. There's some kind of cable running along that would have related to the festival as well. And these are backed up by photographs. We've got photographs of hanging baskets in 1988 on this wall next to a railway station. So we've got these kind of very ephemeral traces surviving as well, and we want to document all of this properly to try and make sure that people can really understand what still survives in the landscape here. And one of the most remarkable survivals is the Sonic Play Trail site, which was I'm not quite sure exactly what it was. It was a kind of a play area that children could engage with different things that would make sounds, and they had interesting textures, and it was a very kind of sensory experience. And I believe it's now back in Mull, this whole arrangement. But this was actually created by these different structures being set in concrete in the shipyard cobbled surface. And that's still there on the ground as a series of these structures, almost like hut circles, and different lines of features, which are in this kind of stalled space that's between two different more recent developments. So we've got this kind of footprint of another festival site here that, again, we need to digitally record and document, because I guess at any time someone could take over this site and build something on it. And then, as I mentioned earlier on, there are a few historic buildings that were there before the festival site started and that have survived and are still there now as well. For instance, the Southern Rotunda, which many of you may know is where you could go down in horses and carts and then cross under the Clyde in a tunnel. There's also the Tower of the Four Winds, which was used during the festival for a tram store and also a cafe. And there was a Nardini's cafe inside the rotunda with a big tenant sign in the middle of it as well. And also a statue of Eros. I'm not quite sure what happened to that, but maybe Lex can say at the end. Time's a bit running short, but the last thing I want to mention is the other part of my research, which hasn't really been developed very far because I haven't really had time to do the archival work yet, but something maybe someone in the audience can help with. The representation of archaeology at the Glasgow Garden Festival was actually relatively thin on the ground. And by far the biggest form of representation was Roman archaeology. So there was various different structures that were very clearly Roman in inspiration. Strathclyde Regional Council had built this massive Roman villa. As far as I know, I haven't seen any photographs of what this looked like inside to see whether the theme was continued, but it's got some Latin writing above the door and so on. So there's definitely a sense of the council connecting themselves to the Antonine Wall. I've mentioned already also we had the reconstruction of the Antonine Gardens, which is the Bearsden Roman bathhouse. This was constructed by Bearsden and Milngavie District Council and was quite a nice replica, and I'll show you pictures in a minute of what it looked like. But bizarrely, after the festival, it was then removed brick by brick and then reconstructed in Milngavie next to Waitrose. So it's still there, and it's still there. It's exactly the same structure. It's just been moved back to Milngavie, even though it was the Bearsden bathhouse. So I don't know what's going on with Eastern Bartonshire politics, but it's still there if you want to visit it. And this is really a remarkable structure. Thanks to the Bearsden Horticultural Society, we've got a very rich archive which has got plans by architects which show what this was supposed to look like, and lots of amazing photographs of the colour, the Roman banners and so on that were there at the site, making this a really very exotic location in the festival trail. And one thing that was really wonderful was we got a list of all of the plants and flowers that were planted at the bathhouse. And they were actually using the different colours of flowers represented the different heats of the rooms in the bathhouse. So the blue flowers were in the tepidarium, the red flowers were in the hot room. I don't know the names of them, I'm not a Romanist. We've got the hotter flower, the orange flowers, yellow. And so that was a kind of a visual guide to the different temperatures of the spaces in the bathhouse. A really wonderful bit of creativity. And then, remarkably, and this is something that exists in none of the Garden Festival material, it's not in the programme, it's not in the maps, a whole complete replica of an Antonine Wall gatehouse made in wood with part of this kind of walkway on either side, very similar to similar reconstructions of, for instance, at Lunt Roman Fort, probably based on examples from Trajan's Column. I've got no idea who was involved in this. I've spoke to David Breeze, Bill Hansen, Lawrence Keppie. None of them have a clue and didn't even know this was here. As far as I can tell, this is the only large-scale or full-scale Roman gatehouse construction that's ever been built in Scotland, and it was only there for 5 months. I don't know who was involved, which Roman archaeologist was helping out with this. We know nothing about it. There are no plans, nothing at all in any of the records. All we have are photographs from people who were there who photographed it on the day. A quite remarkable bit of Roman architecture that's simply completely undocumented. So if anyone knows anything about this, I'd be very appreciative of finding out more. There's a very limited footprint, unfortunately, for prehistory at the festival site. There was a slightly underwhelming stone circle that was constructed as part of the Dumfries and Galloway walk through time, which was accompanied by some leaflets that showed some hairy prehistoric people erecting much bigger standing stones. And we also have from Gordon, and this is Gordon Barr as a child, one of our team members. He is photographed standing next to this mysterious megalith that we have no idea what it is, or we know it was probably in an area called the Magic Garden, but we don't know what it was or why it was there or anything about it at all. And as a promotional leaflet that my father-in-law, Michael, had, and he gave it to me, that I saw recently that had a picture a visualization of the festival, and it's got a little stone circle, an avenue of standing stones that never came into being. But other than that, there's very little prehistoric stuff going on. There's also some early medieval bits and pieces. There's a replica of a Celtic cross from Whithorn, which again was in the Fries and Galloway area of the festival site, and it's now in a housing location in a housing estate in Newton Stewart, if you want to go and visit that replica. And then there was also Michael's other Celtic imagery. And the thing that's quite interesting, and this is a Glasgow thing really, but there was no presence whatsoever from Rangers, despite the fact that Ibrox is only about 10 minutes walk from the Garden Festival site. 1988 was the centenary of Celtic, and they have got a big footprint. They had this flower bed which everyone was photographed next to, except Rangers supporters. And then there's a Celtic shop, which is the only person that would photograph that is Michael. But Rangers had no presence whatsoever, so read into all that what you want. And then finally, we've got this amazing story that I picked up on a clip from the Evening Times about the delivery during the festival of a Russian idol that was from Rostov. At the time, Glasgow was twinned with Rostov-on-Don, a status which was dropped after the Ukraine war started. And so this guy came across with this genuine first millennium AD idol from somewhere in Rostov-on-Don, and it was put into, I think it's a Russian friendship garden, which was on site, and then it was taken away at the end of the festival. So there were even some actual real archaeological objects that ended up being part of the festival itself. So one thing I really want to do in the coming months is to try and think a bit more about the representation of archaeology at the festival and what the stories are behind that. And in particular, I'm very interested to find out more about the Roman gatehouse reconstruction. So the project really is now at a stage where we've done a lot more than we ever imagined we would. In terms of the archaeological work, what I want to do is to complete a proper measured and georeference survey across the whole of the site, including doing topographic survey work, because there is topography that survives from the festival, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to record some of that with Davy McComish, formerly of English Heritage. And that may well lead to a digital heritage trail which runs across the whole site that people can appreciate what survives on the ground, even though in some cases it's modest, like screws in a wall. But these are still tangible connections to something that has almost been entirely swept away by subsequent developments. We also, in the near future, we're going to be installing information panels in Festival Park that have been designed by Lex, and which are drawing on the research of the project, including some of the archaeological work, which will be the first time since 1988 that there's been any recognition that this was actually a place where the Garden Festival happened, other than in the name of the park. And so I think that the archaeology in this research is adding value both by the local community and also visitors to try and understand this very recent heritage of the city, which is in danger of disappearing, which if we don't do this kind of work. And there's also ongoing work happening with interviews and trying to do further research, and I'm going to continue to look at the Roman representations in particular. So for me, I think the archaeology has been incredibly exciting. The students have really enjoyed being involved. The methods are the kinds of methods I would have applied to prehistoric sites, but they've actually been really useful at producing material that's really excited people, and despite the fact that it's relatively recent. And I think the archaeology has demonstrated that there are gaps that no other discipline can quite get to, and that this kind of work will enrich our understanding and story of an event that was a major part of the modern history of Glasgow, and indeed of Scotland. So I will stop at that point, and there's some team members, and thanks to, in particular, the funders of the excavation, the Glasgow City Heritage Trust, and the University of Glasgow. And there's plenty of places online you can find out more. So thank you very much.